You can't just have a crack at it for the funsies.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And Neil Almond.
Hello.
And together, we're going to continue exploring the 2022 Education White Paper. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
This week, I think I'm a little bit late to the party on this one, but this week I discovered a blog by Neil Gilbride. Really fascinating. It looked at aspects of personality and how there might be positive and negative aspects to the same character traits. So, for example, someone who is meticulous and organized might also be someone who gives you a hard time for being late to things, or how someone who is spontaneous might be someone who in their weaker moments lets you down because they're focused on something else with someone else. So it was a really interesting blog that made me reflect on some of my own personality flaws that you two will know all too well. But it was, I'd highly recommend it. It's just one of those blogs that you read and you then think about it for quite some time. And he's written really interesting stuff in the past as well. So worth checking out. What about you, Neil? What you reading for?
So I've been quite fortunate in that with our trust, we've just kind of finished 3 CPD sessions with Alex Bedford on pupil book study. And there's a book that pretty much goes through that process as well. So I've been quite fortunate in that I've read a copy of that. A really interesting take on assessments. I think, retrieval practice, low stake quizzing has been, in vogue for quite a while in terms of, how we assess what students know, but obviously it shouldn't be the only thing that teachers, senior leaders rely on to kind of test and check whether the enacted curriculum is indeed being learned by pupils. And so his pupil book study idea just provides a really interesting and useful framework that teachers and senior leaders can use to talk to students, funnily enough, just about their work and their learning. So you can get some quantitative data from quizzing platforms, but then, that's only ever going to tell you half the story. I think immersing yourself in rich discussions about what pupils are learning is such an interesting way to work out what's happening in schools. So really enjoying reading that. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
I've mentioned this before in the podcast, but I've got a point I'd like to make about it. It's the History of Europe. I think it's just called Europe by, is it Norman Davies, Chris? And in it, he makes an argument at the start, quite a long and drawn-out argument about how he thinks that histories, at the time were too specific and too focused. And I went back to this book to find some information on the Vikings, and in particular, the Great Heathen Army, because I want to do some stuff where I really went in depth into it. And a couple of weeks ago, I talked about how I was listening to the New Silk Roads and the Power of Geography at the same time, which are both reasonably expansive in terms of the geography they cover. And I've decided that I prefer the more detailed and specific, because across those 936 pages, there were maybe 6 pages, and within those 6 pages, maybe 15 sentences about Vikings across all of European history. And I was left dissatisfied. I was like, okay, well, do I really want to invest in this and have a superficial knowledge of all of European history, or would I prefer to know about certain things in depth? And I think I found the opinion that I much prefer the latter. Obviously, Chris, I'm happy to listen to your retort on this, but I just thought I'd mention it because I think Adam Smith mentioned it in season 2 that he prefers, those books that look at one day in history. And that's something that I'm sort of warming to, so that's what I've been reading this week. And I was left with a sour taste in my mouth.
Oh, I think that's slightly unfair on the book. There are glorious little vignettes throughout the book that are, give a little bit of detail a lot of detail about something that you hadn't considered at all about previously. So I think it potentially satisfies those urges for those that are more that way inclined. It might be the case that it does just speak to my own desire to know a little bit of everything rather than a lot about a few things. Perhaps playing devil's advocate on behalf of the book, I think perhaps it's by giving you that overview to begin with, it allows you to put into context those areas that you do particularly enjoy, maybe.
I've no doubt it's without peer in terms of what it sets out to do. I've just decided that that's not for me at the moment. So this week, we are back with the 2022 Education White Paper. We considered some of the key themes last time out. We're going to just continue on with that sort of process. And the next thing that stood out to me was that it said, we will deliver, I think this is one of the subheadings, we will deliver 500,000 teacher training and development opportunities. Thoughts?
You can never have too many teachers, so absolutely bring it in. However, if you're not going to sort out teacher retention, 1/3 of them leaves within the first 5 years, then it's a failure and a bit of a waste of money, to be honest. So I think, yes, obviously we need teachers. I think the latest data for people wanting to teach and teacher applications is, there's only 2 or 3 subjects, I think, meeting their targets. So unless you're really fixing up the system when the teachers are in it, and I think they were kind of hoping that the early career framework would help doing that, depending on who you talk to. It's either pushing more people out rather than keeping more people in. If I was to Ofsted grade this particular point, I think I'd go with requires improvement.
I was immediately reminded of I can't remember who it was in government that made the statement at the time during the pandemic when there was this talk about PPE equipment, and someone said, we've delivered 50 million bits or whatever the number was, but they gave this lovely round figure. And then when you dug below the surface, you found that, they were this close to using each separate finger on a glove as a separate piece of PPE equipment. This lovely big round number, these professional development opportunities, what do they mean by that? And the fact that there's a 60-page document and they haven't specified what they mean by these professional development opportunities makes me, again, perhaps that's a bit cynical, but it makes me think they've just found a way to make a nice big number.
This is when Kieran chimes in and says he's been bankrolled by the DfE, and we're part of this professional development machine.
Oh, I love the idea of the Thinking Deeply podcast being considered as one of these professional development opportunities. What are we on? This will be something like episode 65, 66.
Well, if you believed all the Amazon reviews, you might think that that's the case, and the only right number they left out was my wage. I think the same mathematician might have been involved in this paper, because I've actually dug deep into some of the numbers. We'll get to them in a little bit, and watch out. I mean, it sounds impressive. I think we do need to focus on training and development. The development point, like you say, Neil, is really, really important. Making sure that those teachers who are here feel proficient. What would you do? What would those 500,000 teacher training experiences and development experiences be?
I think you obviously have to give everyone, I think, secondary learning some principles of early mathematics, early literacy, would be quite important. My probably most unpopular opinion is that those secondaries who are attempting to go for the some sort of mastery cycle, you're 7 years too late about it, because by that point the gap is 7 to 9 years, if not more. And if you don't have the pedagogy of how to deliver a phonics lesson, or you don't know how number bonds manifest themselves first of all through subitizing and things like that, then any mastery elements that you think you're providing are still built on sand. Which is not to say that obviously there's not much that primary teachers can't learn from our secondary colleagues. Of course there is. But I really think some subject specific CPD wouldn't go amiss then for primary school teachers, not just more generic ideas of what good teaching might be. I think you need that pedagogical content knowledge, but also I think if there were a suite of subject knowledge courses that teachers could put themselves on as well, that would be quite a big thing. I know Chris ran an interesting poll on Twitter recently about who he thought could every teacher, I think, in your school, would they reach the expected standard at Key Stage 2 mathematics? There were quite a few that said that they don't think every teacher could. And so I think between some real subject-specific pedagogical content knowledge and some real specific subject knowledge enhancements, as well as more focus on our secondary colleagues understanding what those foundational elements of learning and the core ideas of reading, writing, and arithmetic, I think those wouldn't go amiss. And by the time you've done those for every element, I think you're probably about 1/20th of the way there to your to that number.
This feeds directly into my point. And the second part of the specialization 3 subject manifesto. Because if we bring back the MAST, for instance, Matt Swain, tremendous mathematics teacher, that's the kind of teacher the MAST produces. Every MAST teacher that I know is operating on the same level as Matt. And we say to everyone, okay, get really good at teaching 1 or 2 subjects, then you spend your training making those teachers you're describing, and that really sound both subject and subject-specific pedagogical content knowledge. So I genuinely think, it's a shame that course doesn't exist. And if we had an equivalent, for instance, in reading and the other subjects that we want to teach, then I think you're not far off effectively using those 500,000 training and development opportunities in the best possible way.
I think in some ways, actually, there is an opportunity for something akin to mastery style teaching at secondary school that doesn't exist at primary school, because in a lot of places they have that setting. So if you're a large enough school and say you've got sets 1 to 8, you do have something akin to a relatively homogenous group of learners, which you don't, in terms of their previous knowledge, which you don't really have at any point at primary, even though people like to pretend that we do in, say, year 1. So maybe that's one bit to push back on there. Where I absolutely agree with you, Neil, is about on the subject of subject knowledge. Just to mention, the polling question was a little harsher than that. I asked whether teachers would get 100% if they had as much time as they needed and the chance to check their answers so there were no silly errors. It was a way of asking, really, whether there were teachers in the school that didn't have mastery of the full primary mathematics curriculum. It was a way to ask that. And it seemed to be the case. I think it was around 93 or 94% of teachers said there was someone in their school, or there were several people in their school who don't have mastery of the primary mathematics curriculum. I think this is one of these areas where primary teachers perhaps don't realise how that might sound to people on the outside. I think, and again, maybe I'm an exception here, I think it would be a good thing if primary school teachers were all fully competent with the aspects of the maths curriculum that we expect of 10-year-olds. And I think that we don't do enough as a profession to support teachers who come into primary teaching. They may not have learned or done any mathematics for quite some time, and they very rarely actually receive professional development related to subject knowledge. And I think so much of the pedagogical content knowledge can be developed through the way that we engage teachers with subject knowledge. So I think there's a win-win there. I think this speaks somewhat to something that primary colleagues understandably complain about, which is the extent to which aspects of what we do tend to have come from secondary. I think, or I would imagine at least, that subject knowledge is somewhat less of a concern for secondary teachers who are more likely to have a degree or at least A levels in the subject that they're teaching. Yeah, so I think this is one area where some primary specific focus on professional development would be really useful. That's only, as you say though, tiny little chunk of those 500,000 professional development opportunities.
There was a really interesting part there, Chris, where you said, I completely agree with you, Neil. So I'm sitting here wondering, are my ideas not being received by the audience in the way that they're intended?
No, not at all. No, I think the idea of saying that there's no more art, music, history, science, geography in the primary curriculum is bound to be popular, Kieran.
No, it'll still happen, but it just won't be my responsibility.
No, that's fair. I can live with that.
No, it will, but yeah, we had to work out the issue. But I've got until 2030 to work out the full detail of the manifesto, and we'll see. So then this next one, I think, might speak to all of us. It says, we will permanently embed evidence at the heart of teacher development. What does that mean to you? And what were your thoughts when you read that?
In theory, I think that is a worthwhile aim. And I think there are aspects of what the government has tried to do over the last decade or so with regards to evidence in education that are worthwhile, regardless of what I think about the government generally. It pains me to say when the current government have done things I agree with, but there are circumstances that force me into it. That said, the devil's in the detail. It's what they mean by embedding evidence in the profession. I think it's very easy for us to become a profession that believes that it's possible to base every decision on evidence when, in the end, it provides a lodestar. It doesn't tell us exactly how to navigate towards that lodestar.
One of the things that jumped out to me, and this probably speaks to another point later on, sometimes there's an issue in education of whose evidence, because isn't there an issue with what the EEF say about reading and the position that you would adopt, Chris, in terms of reading instruction and how to support pupils in learning to read?
I think with a body like the EEF, what they're trying to do, particularly in the area of reading, is take a mountain of research and make it accessible. And I am the first person who would sympathize with that task and the potential for making mistakes or not being as clear as you'd like to be, and what you choose to leave in, and leave out when you're doing that. That said, I think there are elements about the EEFs, the way they describe reading or have described reading in the past that wasn't ideal, in particular relating to reading recovery. I personally respect the fact that they have stuck with a slightly more, what's the word I'm looking for, cautious approach of describing evidence around phonics and talk. They tend to focus on the consensus that there is around systematic phonics without getting into a bolder approach to say that synthetic phonics is definitely the best way to do things. Lots of people that I respect but don't necessarily agree with would take that more cautious approach. I think there are still some bits and pieces where teachers could get the wrong impression when it comes to the teaching of comprehension skills as such, and still end up teaching inferencing on a Monday and prediction on a Tuesday. But I think that's more down to the way that things are communicated and the difficulty of trying to communicate something quite so complex in a relatively short space. Generally, though, I think the EEF reports are a positive thing in reading, and they do a pretty good job.
I suppose I should clarify that I'm very much in favour of a body like the EEF existing. I think trying to be more evidence-informed, evidence-led, whatever the parlance of the day might be, is a good thing. I suppose the point I was trying to make was the need for more than just reading the summary and acting on the summary. There is so much more. Like you said, cautious approach. It involves really getting under the skin of what the message is. And to avoid things like lethal mutations, we need to dedicate serious time to being evidence informed, which lots of people do. And so I'm not taking a swipe at the EF. Very much, I think the more accessible we can make research for teachers, particularly, time poor and enthusiasm rich primary teachers, the better. But I think, it's a point worth making.
Yeah, I think particularly with something as broad as literacy, I know that the EEF have one for Key Stage 1 literacy, Key Stage 2, one for secondary. I've read through those fairly recently, and they're all, the advice in there is pretty solid. You think, if someone came to that with very little understanding of the evidence related to literacy, they'd come away with that with a better understanding. But if they are then not using that as a jumping off point, using the references that the EEF are using, then it could easily lead to people getting the wrong impression. I think I might have said it a few times before on this podcast, which is that when it comes to poor decisions, the worst decisions I've ever seen made in schools are those who have a superficial understanding of a little bit of evidence. It's not those who know nothing about evidence tend to roughly be okay because they're not going out there generally with these big, bold ideas. Having said that, I said that online the other day, and I remember, I think it was Alex Quigley pushed back on that, and I remember coming away from that thinking, yeah, no, maybe I've just been lucky. Maybe it's just the case that the schools I've worked in that have made really big errors have been those that happen to have had a superficial understanding of the evidence. And maybe there are schools out there who have no understanding of evidence who are still very bold in their mistakes.
I think the other thing you need to be mindful of, I think, with this evidence is obviously the replicability crisis that particularly educational research has. There's unless you're really kind of digging into subject-specific stuff where, hundreds, thousands of studies are done, it's difficult to replicate any kind of research that's done with anything that's done in the actual classroom is so difficult to replicate. So you need to be careful. And so I think, as I say, and whilst I do definitely agree, there is this need to be evidence informed. You need to be very careful that doesn't become an easy way to shut down any discussion or debate as to the direction that evidence is then pointing you towards.
Yeah, very few expressions are as dangerous in our profession as the evidence says.
The next thing that stood out was really interesting, but I didn't necessarily know too much about it. It said, we're going to establish an institute of teaching. Can you guys give me some background knowledge of what that means? Because I've seen the name on Twitter, but I don't know too much about it. And what does that mean to you guys?
Effectively, I think the idea behind it is that there is going to be an initial teacher training provider that is closely monitored in order to ensure that it's evidence informed in the way that we've just discussed, and that it will be used as something of a flagship for evidence informed initial teacher training, and arguably against which they will attempt to judge other ITT providers. I think as well, the idea behind it is that it will be like a laboratory, a small laboratory for trying out certain things and for using it for the basis of research to see, in the phrase that they might use, what works and what doesn't work quite so well.
It's not just there to teach early career teachers, but I think it's there to develop, I think, the new national leaders of education. It's also going to have some remit in training up those people who have experiences of turning around those quote unquote underperforming schools. They'll be sent to this institute, have a bit more training, and then be sent out to educational investment areas in the hope of turning around these schools for all that that's worth.
So is this potentially the first tangible action in the document? It's jumping out at me as the first thing that's actually going to happen that we can see why it might be beneficial. Standardizing the quality of training for both our most experienced and our least experienced. This sounds like it could have quite a decent impact on teacher confidence, teacher competence over an extended period. Am I interpreting that right?
I think so, but it's generous because this is nothing new. I mean, in terms of the announcement, this is old. People have known about this for a long time now. This is really just saying, oh, by the way, we're doing this too. So if we consider it as an essential aspect of the white paper rather than just a reminder of something they've already announced, then yeah, it has that potential. But on top of that, it's, as with many aspects of this document, it sounds good, but it's a bit like someone saying, I'm going to make you a delicious cake. It's like, well, fantastic. But in the end, a lot of this is going to come down to who's making the cake, what are the ingredients? And without knowing those things, it's impossible to judge whether we're talking about something that is going to be as good as it's described.
Yeah, and just to pull on Chris's metaphor there's also quite a lot of other cake makers in this market in terms of training teachers. So it's going to be quite an interesting. I'm eager to see how this institute kind of fits in with the regional school hubs who are fulfilling the early career framework right now, and how those elements all come together. So like, is this institute going to kind of like sit above those, and it's going to then kind of like pass and like information down through these hubs? Is it going to almost make the hubs almost, are the hubs going to be drawn in and become part of this institute of teaching? That's the level of detail that I'm interested in, and that I don't think I've seen an answer to. But I think you're right, Kieran. I think it's also one of the things that a minister could come on the television tomorrow and say, oh, look, here's the first new shiny thing that we said we were going to do. Isn't it really shiny? Isn't it great? It's going to make life so much better for everyone. But I think the ball's in their court to make this a worthwhile investment in terms of public spending that actually will have tangible outcomes for teachers and therefore students as well.
Oh, that's on me then, because I was today years old when I fully read about it for the first time. So yeah, maybe that's been in the background and I've just not really paid attention to it. So yeah, watch this space. So then we spoke a bit about teacher retention in the last episode. One of the things in this section, around page 23, when they talked about investing in teachers, attracting the best teachers, was an increase in the number of people who get the opportunity to experience teaching before deciding whether to enter the profession. What do you reckon about the success of that model? And what might that model look like?
I can't see it working. Quite honestly, I think it sounds ridiculous. At least if they're only in it for, if they come in as an early career teacher, it's someone who really knows that it isn't for them, who therefore like doesn't see out the rest of that induction period. if you're kind of giving people a taste of, and it also all depends where they are. If you're giving people a taste of, do you know what, actually, you know, sometimes, you know, the children are quite rude to you, or yeah, it isn't just, you know, you're not rocking up at 10 minutes before the kids arrive, and you're certainly not leaving, 10 minutes after the kids arrive, and you're doing a potentially 50 to 60 hour work week. I can't see how that's going to help things personally.
Even practically speaking, I'm trying to think how you go about that. How do you get people trying out teaching? There's a responsibility here. You are educating children. You can't just have a crack at it for the funsies, like, oh yeah, take my lesson for a bit, see if you like it. That would be irresponsible. I presume that's not what the government are considering, but I wouldn't necessarily put it past those in power, given their seeming understanding of the education system at points. In theory, the idea of people somehow having the chance to experience the classroom, assuming the DBS checks and that sort of thing are all in place, the chance to be a teaching assistant for a few weeks and to be paid by the government, say, to be in a classroom and to see what it's all about as a way of attracting graduates. I know from personal experience, there are quite a lot of graduates who come out of university and go, I thought I'd have an idea of what I wanted to do with my career by now, but I really don't. And so some opportunities to experience a classroom, to see what teaching is about, might be a good thing. However, coming back on Neil's point, and I'm full of the food metaphors today, but I think there's an extent to which teaching is an acquired taste. And for a lot of people, it takes a little time to acquire that taste. And you might put people off who otherwise, had they not had that taste and just gone straight into a PGCE and then felt forced to give it a year because they've committed that time to a PGCE, you might actually end up losing teachers because that initial experience of teaching might not be positive, particularly if you are someone who works in a challenging secondary school or who has that experience in a challenging secondary school where the joys of it sometimes aren't immediately apparent.
You listen back to all the interviews that include people recounting their initial experiences of teaching. It's really clear that the first couple of years are tough. And I think in episode 10, Chris, we talk about our experience as early career teachers and how we just felt like we weren't very good and then was crushing. It's only when you get proficient that you start to enjoy the job. I think last time Neil was talking about how he wishes he could spend more time in the classroom. I love being in the classroom now, but in year one, everything was a struggle. Behavior, pedagogy, even the small details of school life. So it runs counter to the experience of a teacher, I think, because I think we've got a big enough sample. Some of the best teachers I know struggled in that first couple of years. So what does that mean for someone who's just having a taste? I think if the early career framework radicalizes how teachers experience those first couple of years, and once we've refined that model and we've got a system that allows people to flourish early on, then perhaps that might be a really good idea. But then this might be something that it's one sentence in a 68-page document. It may never be mentioned again. This might be the most it's ever talked about.
It certainly might be the most it's ever thought about.
You are channeling your inner Ian Hislop tonight, Christopher. So then we move on to, I think, one that you guys will find most interesting. And it's all to do with the idea of curriculum design and how it's an expert skill. I'll read the paragraph. Curriculum design is an expert skill, yet too many teachers reinvent the wheel and design new lessons, with recent TeacherTaPE data showing 46% of primary teachers are planning their lessons from scratch. This situation fails those new teachers and fails the children they teach. In no other profession are newly trained employees expected to discover by trial and error how to deliver. Instead, as with other top professions, we must do more to support new teachers to succeed. Now, I reckon we agree with the sentiment, but how do we make that reality?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's a bizarre one because it was almost like a rite of passage. Certainly, when I was training, and perhaps it was when you two were as well. It was almost like a rite of passage in that you had to almost make your own things from scratch, and it was actually seen, as some sort of underperformance. The fact that you might dare use someone else's planning, resourcing, worksheets, whatever it may be, and you were potentially made to feel, quite guilty that, despite putting in about 60 hours worth of work, you still weren't working hard enough or long enough to make it happen. I agree that, especially that first sentiment about, curriculum design being an expert skill, and I think, why would you want to overload novice teachers with not only, effective pedagogy and, just, the day-to-day school life, which is all consuming, with also, now I really want you to think about how you're going to, sequence your maths content, especially with our hierarchical subjects, which, rely so much on, getting that order relatively, arranged and organized in a relatively sensible manner. How we make that happen, how the government want to make it happen, is through the use of Oak National, which obviously was created during the pandemic and came up very quickly to support plenty of schools with remote learning. It's an answer. I don't think it's the answer, and I don't think even I would personally be comfortable of just one organization just offering one particular passage. I think package. I think there does need to be some sort of marketplace. I use the term marketplace with a bit of caution in that I think, and this is something that Christopher, that old socialist, has definitely fundamentally changed my thoughts and opinions about the competitive nature between schools and, schools paying other schools for resourcing, despite the fact that it's public funds that have created those resources in the first place. So, I mean, it's good that Oak will be free, but I'm conscious that, they're putting all their eggs in one basket and it's just all going to be, Oak will somehow save us. I think it probably will be better than, going on to TES and just typing in a few keywords and downloading whatever, PowerPoint. It's going to, teachers will hopefully be saving money from this and not buying some pretty, dodgy resourcing for £2.50 from Tesnit going to, whatever teacher, or in some cases just someone who's just uploaded something. So yeah, I'm I'm cautious about what's going to happen. I hope it works, but I think it's going to need a lot of work to make it successful. What I hope, though, and this is one that I'm sure you'll agree, Kieran, is that this could be the precursor to the national textbook.
That's exactly where I was going to come in, because I think my point, Chris, runs counter to Neil's. I really like the idea of a central curricular body that enacts an actual national curriculum, whereby, like I said before, autonomy in this area is reduced to increase the consistency of offering to pupils. Where I think I would go further, because it says that engagement is optional and that it will be done in collaboration. When they say about we need experts to design that, in thinking about primary mathematics, I talk about how many experts you would need and how long they would need and how difficult a process curricular design is. I would have experts in each field without ministerial intrusion, making the decisions, and then for a 10-year period, that's the national curriculum. And then we review in 2040, and then we review in 2050, and then that way we can ensure the diet that pupils get. We can trust that they're made on sound bases. So I would go further than what's suggested in the document. And I think I'll regress because I've made myself perfectly redundant.
I don't think I'm totally on board with the idea of a central, fully resourced national curriculum in that sense, if it means that schools have to use it. They have to use it, and they have to use, say, the resources and the lessons that might come with it in the way that is stated. I think it has to be, I think there's value in there being a centralized curriculum or a set of centralized curricula from which to choose. Certainly, I think schools should ideally have the room to adapt it, change it, personalize it, make it suit their communities. Because one of the first things you think here is that little kind of small percentage of any curriculum, it is a small percentage in my view, but that kind of 3, 4, 5% that is, this is about our community, it's about our community's history, our community's geography, etc. I think you're losing something with a true national curriculum if there isn't room to adapt that. I also think there's questions about small schools. If you're a school with shared year groups and you have to go on a 2-year cycle, exactly how that works, if you've got a curriculum that's sequenced from 1 to 6, well, it doesn't. And you can't just then say, oh, well, we'll teach it and then swap years round, because it won't be sequenced properly. You really have to do some quite different curriculum sequencing to make something work in those smaller schools. So I think there has to be that flexibility. I'll very quickly push back on the idea that I'm a socialist. I am very much centrist, Dad. I'm one of these people who thinks that, markets are quite a positive thing, but they are a beast of burden. They need to be reined in order to be positive. So yeah, so I'm just imagining like people sending me Das Kapital through the post. It wouldn't be the end of the world. Something to read.
Improvement on the things you get sent.
Yeah. In short, though, I've advocated for there being some centralized resources. So this could potentially be done well. I'm slightly worried that, again, it comes back to who's delivering this, who's sorting this. And I don't mean Oak, because I fully respect what they did at short notice during the pandemic. I know a lot of schools, including one I worked in, benefited hugely from their work. But I do slightly worry that there are ministers right now who are saying, well, Oak exists. We just need to give that a little bit of a tweak and that's ready to go. And that just obviously isn't the case. It is miles away from being a curriculum that a school could pick up and use. Miles away from that. So it's effectively a job of almost starting from scratch for Oak or whoever then works with Oak to contribute to that. So as long as they don't think at the government that the job's mostly done and so they want it rolled out in the next year or so, and that there's genuinely the time dedicated to bringing in expertise from across the profession and outside the profession, then yeah, it could be positive. But again, I guess it comes down to how much you trust the government in this case.
It will be really interesting. And like you, I think it's one of those things that needs a lot of time. Like writing a curriculum, just one subject is going to take ages. If somehow, Oak will have to go on a massive hiring spree and take out teachers, if it's going to be the expert teachers, take those expert teachers out of the classroom to actually write these things. And like I say, you can't rush it. You're going to need a good it's probably going to be more like closer to 2030 than to 2020 by the time this could be up and running to the point where it's actually of high quality. What it could do quite interestingly, is almost make the inspection framework somewhat redundant, because the moment one school is rated, good or outstanding in terms of their curriculum, and they just follow what Oak have done, I think you'd see then quite a substantial change in what schools do, or could change to make it make the work-life balance far more favourable to their teachers.
So I'm completely with you. I think the expertise is key, but I also have the confidence in those behind Oak to either search out those experts where necessary or to use their own expertise in development. But we'll still be going in 2030. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out over the lifetime of the next 8 seasons of Thinking Deeply, or next 8 years of Thinking Deeply about primary education. And I think in terms of unique to schools, and I completely agree, Chris, that there are elements of geography and history and perhaps most of the foundation curriculum that are quite specific. But if you recall, in my dream scenario, we're only teaching 3 subjects. So that doesn't sound like a me problem. And on that bombshell, we finish our second, but not final episode on the 2022 white paper. So all that's left to say is thank you very much for joining me, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Always a pleasure.
And until next time, to everyone at home, thanks for listening.